"Grandpa, we need a volunteer who's never touched anything better than a squirrel gun," Corey Blackwood said into the microphone, grinning at the crowd before he'd even looked the old man in the face. "So how about it, sir? You want to hold a real rifle for once?" 2,000 meters downrange, a steel plate the size of a dinner tray waited under a sky gone hazy with heat. In 4 minutes, a stooped farmer in a faded barn coat would put a single round through its center, and every camera on the line would catch 300 people go dead silent at once. But that comes later. First, you have to understand why Gilbert Sowell had spent 5 Octobers idling his truck outside this gate, engine ticking, hands on the wheel, never once pulling in, like a man checking a watch that wasn't there, waiting to see whether the place would be torn down before he let himself walk through it, or finished before he had to. If you've ever been underestimated by someone holding a clipboard and a title, type steady in the comments. The Thackeray Long Range Invitational filled a converted cattle ranch in the High Plains, 2,200 meters of open ground fenced now with sponsor banners instead of barbed wire, and Corey Blackwood ran it the way he ran everything, with a ballistic computer clipped to his belt and a laugh built for live stream audiences. He was 34, 3-time regional champion, sponsored 6 ways from Sunday, and good, genuinely good, the kind of good that comes from a decade of discipline and a scope worth more than Gilbert's truck. He tapped his stock twice before every shot, a habit so old he no longer noticed doing it, and he had learned to read a crowd the way other men read wind. What he hadn't learned yet, standing there with the borrowed rifle held out like a prop, was that the old man reaching for it had once taught men exactly like him to read wind for a living, back when the wind mattered more than any number a computer could spit out. Gilbert took the rifle the way a man takes something he has been handed 1,000 times before. No fumbling, no hesitation, just a settling of weight into hands that had been trembling faintly seconds earlier, and now, closing around cold steel, did not tremble at all. The crowd laughed at that too, at the idea of him even lifting it steady, not knowing what they were looking at, not knowing yet what the stillness cost him, or what it meant. Somewhere behind the firing line, a young range safety officer named Trent Mosier stopped laughing before anyone else did, watching the old man's eyes move not to the rifle, not to the target, but to the grass along the 2-kilometer corridor, reading something none of them had thought to look at. The mystery wouldn't announce itself yet, not the envelope folded soft inside the cracked leather of Gilbert's data book, addressed to a founder who might not even remember the name on the front. Not the 5 years of October spent circling this gate like a buzzard that couldn't decide whether the thing below was dead or only sleeping. That story moves slower than the one Corey Blackwood thought he was hosting, and it moves through paper before it moves through anyone's pride. For now, a joke, a borrowed rifle, a crowd expecting a punchline. What they were about to get instead was arithmetic older than most of them, delivered in one breath, at a range that would make 3 sponsored champions look like men who had never held a rifle at all. Gilbert's truck was a 1988 Ford, the color of dried mud, and it had taken him 40 minutes to drive the 11 miles from his farm, not because the truck couldn't do better, but because he never asked it to. He parked at the gravel lot's far edge, same as always, nose pointed toward the exit, the way Ruth used to tease him about. Always ready to leave a party before it started, she'd said, and he'd never once argued the point because she wasn't wrong. He sat with the engine ticking down and looked at the range gate through the windshield, at the new banner strung across it reading Thackeray Long Range Invitational in letters big enough to read from the county road, and he did not get out. On the bench seat beside him sat a data book bound in leather, gone the color and softness of an old glove, its spine cracked clean through in one place and mended with waxed thread he'd done himself, twice, over the decades. He picked it up now the way another man might pick up a hymnal, out of habit more than need, and opened it not to read, but to touch. Pages soft as cloth, columns of his own handwriting recording wind calls, and range cards going back further than most of the men inside that gate had been alive. Near the back, tucked flat against the binding, a folded envelope showed only its edge, addressed in block letters to a name he had never once mailed it to. He hummed as he thumbed the pages. Lo, tuneless to anyone who didn't know it, though anyone who'd sat on his porch on a summer evening would have recognized it inside 4 notes, the hymn Ruth used to hum while she shelled peas into a chipped enamel bowl, back when her hands moved without thinking, and his did too, though for different reasons. 6 years gone now, and the humming hadn't stopped. It had just lost its other half. His left hand carried a tremor these days, small, persistent, the kind that made pouring coffee an act of concentration. It showed now, faint against the book's cover, fingers not quite steady on the worn leather. It would still the moment he closed that same hand around a rifle's forend, the way it always had, some old wiring in him that knew the difference between holding a memory and holding a tool. But that was still to come. For now the tremor stayed, small and human, while he sat in a truck that smelled of hay and gun oil and did the thing he always did before he could make himself walk through any gate that mattered. He checked the spine of the book, ran his thumb along the mended crack, and made sure the envelope was still there, still folded, still unsent. He wore what he always wore to town, an olive barn coat gone soft and faded past its original color, a flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows from 50 years of leaning on fence rails and truck beds, and a ball cap bleached the color of old bone by 4 decades of sun. Nothing about him said range day. Nothing about him said anything at all, which was, Gilbert had found, the most useful thing a man his age could wear. He'd registered under his own name every year for 5 years running, filled out the paper at a folding table under a pop-up tent, paid the modest walk-on fee, and then, more often than not, driven home again without ever raising a rifle, content just to watch from the crowd, to see what the place had become, to see whether it still stood. This year the tent had a line, and a boy no older than 20, manning the sign-in sheet, and Gilbert took his place in it, same as anyone, data book tucked under one arm, and waited his turn without looking like a man who had once taught soldiers to read wind for a living. The line at the registration tent moved the way lines always did at events like this, briskly for the young men in matching team polos with company logos stitched over the heart, and considerably less briskly once Gilbert reached the folding table and set down his name. "Sowell," said the boy behind the table, squinting at his own clipboard like the name might rearrange itself into something more familiar. You shooting today, sir, or just here for the exhibition?" "Shooting," Gilbert said, and left it at that. Word travels fast in a crowd built mostly of young men who spend their weekends comparing muzzle velocities, and by the time Gilbert reached the firing line with his walk-on badge clipped to his coat, Corey Blackwood had already clocked him from 30 yards off. The stoop, the faded coat, the cap gone pale as bone, and made the kind of decision a man makes when he's been handed a live microphone and 45 minutes of dead air to fill before the real competitors take their positions. "Folks, we've got a special guest on the line today," Corey announced, and the crowd, sensing showmanship, drew closer. "This is what I love about this sport. Anybody can walk up and give it a try. Sir, you ever fired anything with a scope on it bigger than a coffee can?" A ripple of laughter went through the gallery, easy and unmalicious in the way cruelty always insists it's harmless, right up until it lands somewhere it shouldn't. A woman near the rope line snapped a photo. Somewhere behind her, 2 men in matching Kensington Precision Optics vests exchanged a look that said they'd seen this bit before and knew how it ended, with the old-timer missing wide, the crowd applauding his good sportsmanship, and Corey moving smoothly onto the paying talent. Gilbert said nothing. He stood with his weight settled evenly, hands loose at his sides, and looked not at Corey, not at the crowd, but past all of it, out toward the 2-kilometer corridor of open plain where the flags hung on their poles at staggered distances, reading something in their movement, long before anyone offered him a reason to. Trent Mosier noticed first. 24 years old, 8 months into the job of range safety officer, Trent had grown up 2 counties over, on a farm not so different from whatever Gilbert had come from, and something in the old man's stillness snagged his attention the way a familiar smell does before you can name it. He watched Gilbert's eyes track the near flag, then the mid-range flag, then something even farther out that Trent himself couldn't quite place. Grass, maybe, the way it leaned and settled in the corridor between the 600 and 1200 marks. "He's reading it," Trent said, mostly to himself, and nobody around him heard, because they were all still laughing at the coffee can joke. "Come on up here, sir. We'll get you set up," Corey called, waving Gilbert toward a bench with an exaggerated, game show sweep of his arm. "Don't worry. We'll keep the group nice and tight for you. Inside 100 yards, if you want it." 2,000 meters will do, Gilbert said. The laughter that followed was bigger than the first round, rolling back through the gallery in waves, because to that crowd 2,000 meters was a boast so absurd it barely registered as an insult, more like a punchline the old man had handed them himself. Corey grinned into the microphone, delighted, already narrating the moment for the live stream chat, scrolling somewhere on a screen he couldn't see. Only Trent Mosier didn't laugh, watching instead the way Gilbert's left hand, faintly unsteady at his side, had already begun to still the moment it drifted toward the rifle rack, like a tool recognizing its own hand before the hand had even closed. The first sponsored shooter to try the 2,000-meter plate was a broad-shouldered young man from a rival optics team, and he missed low by nearly a full meter, the round kicking up a gray gout of dust well short of the steel. Corey's voice stayed smooth on the livestream feed regardless. "Tough read out there today, folks. That thermal's playing tricks on everybody." While behind him, the wind flags at 600 meters swung a full 10 degrees off what they'd shown a minute before. Gilbert watched from the gallery rail, unbothered, unhurried, the data book closed under his arm. He did not need to be told the wind had shifted. He had clocked it in the grass along the corridor, a full 30 seconds before the flags caught up, the way a man reads a sentence before his eye reaches the final word, and in his head, without paper, without a computer clipped to his belt, he ran the correction anyway, quietly, for no one, a private exercise, the way another man might work a crossword he had no intention of mailing in. The second shooter, a woman sponsored by a rifle stock manufacturer with a name stitched across her sleeve in gold thread, dialed her scope with the practiced efficiency of someone who trusted her ballistic app more than her own eyes, checked the readout twice, and put her round high and left, rattling the frame of the target stand without troubling the plate itself. The gallery groaned in sympathy. Corey called it brutal conditions for the cameras, tapped his stock twice out of habit, and did not once look toward the grass. Gilbert did the math again in his head, a full click different from what she'd dialed, and said nothing, because nobody had asked him, and because 30 years of teaching young men to shoot had taught him something else first, that a lesson offered before it's wanted lands like an insult, no matter how kindly it's meant. The third shooter was Corey's own protege, a 19-year-old prodigy. The sponsor had flown in special, and the crowd hushed, the way crowds do when they sense the day's real spectacle approaching. He took his time, checked his data twice, made a show of licking a finger and holding it up, though the flags told him everything already, and fired a shot that clipped the very edge of the plate's steel frame, close enough to draw an appreciative roar, far enough that the day's leaderboard still showed a column of zeros where a 2,000-meter hit should be. "That's what I'm talking about, folks. That's precision shooting at its absolute limit," Corey said into the mic, riding the crowd's energy like a man who'd forgotten there was anyone left to shoot. He turned, still grinning, scanning for his next segment, and his eyes landed on the old farmer at the rail, the borrowed rifle joke not yet spent. Gilbert watched the wind shift once more, a full quarter turn, the grass at the 900 mark laying flat and then rising again in a way that told him more than any anemometer bolted to a post ever could. He had seen this exact pattern of air, decades ago, moving across a different kind of ground, and his hand, resting on the rail, had already gone still. "All right, folks, let's give the people what they came for," Corey said, waving Gilbert forward with the same showman's flourish as before, though something in his voice had gone a shade quicker, a shade less certain, without his quite knowing why. "Sir, you said 2,000 meters. Let's see you try." The rifle he handed over was a loaner from the exhibition rack. Decent glass, a stock that had passed through a dozen unfamiliar hands that morning, nothing dialed in for anyone in particular. Gilbert took it the way he'd taken the first one, no fumbling, and this time nobody laughed right away, because Trent Mosier had stepped closer to the rail, and something in his stillness had begun, without a word, to spread. Gilbert did not ask for the ballistic computer clipped to Corey's belt. He set the rifle's bipod on the bench, settled behind it, with the economy of a man who had done this 10,000 times before most of the crowd was born, and looked once, briefly, toward the mirage rising off the plain, that shimmer of heat where distant air bends light, a language Corey's expensive optics could see but not read. He watched it boil and settle, and in the space of 4 seconds he read wind at 600 meters, wind at 1200, and a crosswind gusting through the last 200 meters of the corridor that no flag on the range had been planted to catch, and no anemometer had been built to measure. He opened the data book one-handed, thumbed past pages soft as cloth, to a column of his own handwriting older than Corey Blackwood's entire life, and made one adjustment on the scope's turret, a fraction of a fraction, dialed from memory rather than app. "That's not even accounting for the thermal drift," Corey said, half to the camera, half to himself, watching the readout on his own device disagree with what the old man had just dialed. Gilbert didn't answer. He breathed once, let half of it go, and in the pause between one heartbeat and the next, in the stillness that had swallowed his tremor whole, the instant his palm closed around the forend, he broke the shot. The report cracked out across the plain and rolled back a full 2 seconds later, and in the gap between the sound leaving and the sound returning, nobody in that crowd of 300 people breathed at all. Downrange, the steel plate rang once, a single clean note carrying back across 2,000 meters of open plain, and a puff of dust rose dead center where the round had struck. Nobody cheered. Corey Blackwood stood with the microphone still raised halfway to his mouth, his own ballistic computer blinking a correction that had nothing to do with what had just happened, and for a long moment, the only sound on the whole range was wind moving through grass that Gilbert's soul had read a full 30 seconds before anyone else even looked at it. Trent Mosier said it first, quiet, almost to himself. He called the mirage. The scoring booth's automated system took 11 seconds to disagree with everyone's eyes. A red light blinked across the main display screen mounted above the announcer's table, and a flat electronic voice declared, to the entire silent crowd, that the shot had been flagged as a sensor anomaly, pending manual review, certification withheld. "That happens sometimes with loaner rifles," Corey said quickly, recovering his microphone voice, though it came out thinner than before. "Chronograph probably clipped something in the crosswind. We'll get it sorted." Nobody in the gallery believed the wind had clipped anything. Trent Mosier didn't move from the rail, watching Gilbert set the borrowed rifle down with the same unhurried care he'd picked it up with, as if the machine's objection were a weather report he'd already accounted for. The dispute over certification sent a young archivist named Priya 3 months into cataloging the range's history for a display case nobody had funded yet, down into the equipment shed to pull the facility's original 1971 range ledger for comparison, the theory being that a book old enough might settle an argument a computer couldn't. She returned 12 minutes later with dust on her sleeves and an expression that stopped Corey mid-sentence. The ledger's binding was cracked leather, government issue, and most of its pages held the flat, formal script of decades of range officers, logging distances and scores, in a hand meant to be read by no one in particular. But one page, dated October of 1971, had been razored out close to the spine. Not torn, cut. A clean, deliberate line any archivist could recognize as intentional, and in its place, taped in later, with yellowing adhesive, gone brittle at the edges, sat a single typed slip crediting a manufacturer field demonstration for a qualifying shot at the same distance Gilbert had just fired, with no name attached at all. "That's not period typeface," Priya said, half to herself, turning the page toward the light. "This was added, years after the fact." Corey Blackwood looked at the slip, then at Gilbert, then at the closed data book still tucked under the old man's arm, and something in his chest, that had been loose and easy all morning, drew suddenly, uncomfortably tight. Colonel Emmett Dunbar arrived at the announcer's tent 9 minutes later, summoned the way honorary patrons always are, a phone call from someone junior, careful and apologetic, asking if he wouldn't mind coming down to settle a small dispute about a shot the censors didn't like. He was 81, moved with the unhurried authority of a man who'd once commanded far larger crowds than this one, and he crossed the gravel toward the scoring booth, already composing, in his head, some gracious ceremonial words about equipment and patience. Then he saw the data book under Gilbert Soule's arm, cracked spine, mended with waxed thread, and every ceremonial word went out of him at once. Soule, he said, and the name came out rough, almost too quiet for the microphone still hovering nearby. He crossed the last few yards faster than a man his age should, and came to something very near attention in front of a farmer in a faded barn coat, which drew a confused murmur from the crowd that didn't understand yet what they were watching. Gilbert, my God, it's really you. Colonel, Gilbert said, and nothing more, though his hand, when Dunbar gripped it, did not tremble at all. It was Priya, still holding the razored ledger, who broke whatever spell had settled over the two old men, turning the book toward Dunbar, almost apologetically. Sir, I don't know if this means anything to you, but the entry from 1971, the manufacturer demonstration credit, do you recognize the wording? Dunbar took the ledger in both hands, and as he read the typed slip, his face went the color of old paper, his mouth moving once, twice, before any sound came out. I've read this line, he said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle on the last word. At every anniversary dinner for 10 years, I praised this facility for honoring its founding demonstration. I stood at a podium and thanked a company. He looked up at Gilbert, stricken. It was never a company, it was you. It was 1969, all over again, and I didn't even know I owed you twice. Corey Blackwood, standing just behind them with a press packet already printed for tomorrow's 9 o'clock contract signing, felt the floor of his own morning tilt sideways, because the name on that sponsor's packet, the one citing this exact demonstration as proof of battlefield pedigree, was Kensington Precision Optics, and the signing ceremony was 14 hours away. The tent had gone quiet enough that Gilbert's voice, when he finally spoke, carried to every corner of it without needing the microphone at all. October of 1971, he said. I was 29. Last months of my time in, teaching wind reading to boys, not much older than the ones standing at that rail today. They wanted a qualifying shot on record before I mustered out, so I fired one, and somebody typed my name at the top of a slip and filed it. He paused, and in the pause the whole tent seemed to lean toward him. I never asked for a plaque. I never asked for a dinner. I came back here every October since Ruth passed, because she used to say this land would make a fine thing someday, and I wanted to see whether anybody kept their word about that. Colonel Dunbar, still holding the razored ledger like something that might crumble, looked at Corey Blackwood with an expression the younger man had never once earned from a superior officer. Not anger, something worse, disappointment, aimed past him at a name higher up the chain. Who authorized cutting a page out of a government-adjacent range ledger, he asked, though he already suspected, from the sponsor patch stitched over Corey's heart, exactly which company's fingerprints would turn up on the request. Corey didn't answer right away. He was doing arithmetic of his own, the kind that had nothing to do with mirage or crosswind, the signing ceremony scheduled for 9 the next morning, the press packet already at the printer citing this exact demonstration as proof of Kensington's scope surviving under combat-adjacent conditions, and the fact that he was, at this moment, the only person in the tent with working access to that printer. I didn't authorize it, he said finally, and his voice had lost the showman's polish entirely, gone flat and young, but I've been standing on it for 4 years without asking who did. I didn't come back for the record, Gilbert said, plain as a man reading a grocery list, and something in the way he said it made even the crowd pressed against the rope line go still. I came back because she always wanted to see this place finished. Nobody asked who she was. Colonel Dunbar's face told them before Gilbert could, and the old colonel reached out and closed his hand once over Gilbert's forearm, the gesture of a man who understood exactly how much weight sat behind 4 small words. Tell them what happened, Dunbar said quietly. All of it, however plain you want to make it. So Gilbert told it plain, the way he'd have told a neighbor across a fence rail. 8 years in, 2 tours, The back half spent teaching boys to read wind, because somebody decided a man who'd survived long-range work ought to pass it on before he went home to farm corn and hay for the rest of his life. A single qualifying shot at this same 2,000-meter distance, fired on a cold October morning in 1971, with a flag, sewn by his own wife, flying over the makeshift course, because the government hadn't gotten around to shipping a proper one yet. His name typed at the top of a slip nobody thought twice about for 50 years, until somebody with more money than patience decided that slip was worth more with his name gone from it. Ruth stitched that flag herself, Gilbert said. Stayed up 2 nights doing it because she didn't like the idea of boys qualifying under a bare pole. She never got to see this place with buildings on it, never got to see it be anything but a cattle pasture with a target stuck at the far end. He looked out past the tent flap toward the corridor where his shot still rang faint in everyone's memory. When they offered me a prize check, a minute ago, I told the young man I didn't want it. I still don't. I'll take one thing, if it's not too much trouble. Name it, Colonel Dunbar said, before Corey could even open his mouth. There's talk of a new plaque going up, now that the old ledger's been found out for what it is, Gilbert said. Put her name on it beside mine, Ruth Sowell. She's owed that flag as much as I'm owed that shot. Corey Blackwood stood with the press packet still in his hand, Kensington Precision Optics logo bright across its cover, and for the first time all day, he wasn't thinking about the live stream, or the signing ceremony, or the number of subscribers watching the feed scroll past in real time. He was thinking about 4 years of tapping his stock, twice before every shot, a ritual he'd built, without ever once wondering whose ground he was standing on to build it. I'll draft the correction myself, he said, quiet, mostly to Dunbar, though the words were meant for Gilbert, tonight, before anybody signs anything in the morning. 3 weeks later, on a cold, bright Saturday, with the grass along the corridor lying flat under a wind that behaved itself for once, the Thackeray Long Range Invitational unveiled its new dedication plaque at the base of the flagpole nearest the 2,000-meter line. Bronze, freshly cast, it read Gilbert Sowell 1971, founding qualifying shot, and beneath it, in letters the same size, Ruth Sowell, who sewed the flag that flew that day. Colonel Emmett Dunbar stood at attention through the whole brief ceremony, and Corey Blackwood, standing a step behind him in a plain range jacket, with no sponsor patch stitched over the heart, read the corrected history aloud to a crowd considerably quieter and considerably more attentive than the one that had laughed 5 weeks before. Kensington Precision Optics' name appeared nowhere on the new plaque, and nowhere in the corrected press release either. The contract signing had gone forward a day late and a great deal more carefully worded, and what became of Dale Kensington's business afterward was a matter for lawyers and boardrooms Gilbert Sowell had no interest in attending. Trent Mosier, newly promoted to lead range safety officer, kept a laminated copy of the old, doctored ledger page pinned inside the equipment shed, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the day he'd learned to notice what everyone else looked past. Some debts don't come due in court. They come due at dawn, on a plane, in front of everyone who ever laughed. That evening, back on his own land, 11 miles from the range gate he no longer needed to circle, Gilbert Sowell sat at his kitchen table as the light outside went the color of weak tea, the kettle on the stove just beginning to sing low behind him. His data book lay closed on the table's worn oak, spine mended, the folded envelope inside it finally opened and answered, and put to rest weeks before, no longer a question he carried unspoken through every October. On the windowsill above the sink sat Ruth's reading glasses, dusted that morning, the way he dusted them every morning, catching the last of the daylight in their lenses. He hummed the old hymn low, 4 notes and then 4 more, the same tune she used to carry while she shelled peas into a chipped enamel bowl on this same porch, and behind him, the kettle's whistle rose slow and steady into the quiet of a house that had, after all these years, finally been paid what it was owed.